What do you think the numbers are of sleep-deprived people in this country?
So we know those numbers, actually. Almost 1 out of every 2 adults in America are not getting the recommended 8 hours of sleep.
Wow.
Almost 1 out of every 3 people that you pass on the street are trying to survive on 6 hours or less of sleep. Back in 1942, Gallup did a poll, and what they found was that the average American adult was sleeping 7.9 hours of sleep a night. Now that number, most recently, is down to 6 hours and 31 minutes for the average adult during the week in America. That's the average, by the way. That means that there's a huge swath of people well below that average.
Now, what about the people that say that they sleep, they go to bed, they sleep 5 hours, they wake up and they feel great?
Yeah.
Is that bullshit?
We have the number of people who can survive on 6 hours of sleep or less without showing any impairment rounded to a whole number and expressed as a percent of the population is 0.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. 0.
And one of the big problems with a lack of sleep, by the way, is that you don't know you're sleep deprived when you're sleep deprived. So your subjective sense of how well you're doing with a lack of sleep is a miserable predictor of objectively how you're doing. So it's
especially
like a drunk driver.
Men, right?
Yeah,
right.
Especially,
Yeah.
Perfect example. You know, you're at the bar, you've had 6 or 7
I'm
shots, and you say,
fine.
I can drive home, I'm fine. And
Yeah.
your response is,
Right.
I know that you think you're fine to drive subjectively,
Right.
objectively, trust me, you're not. It's the same way with sleep deprivation.
That's fascinating. So, but you're not drunk. So even though you're impaired, you don't feel like you're impaired. And you probably have a couple espressos or have one of these caveman coffees. You feel fine.
Right.
You get juiced up. You're ready to go. And you're trying to accomplish things. You're trying to succeed, right? You're trying to get ahead in this life.
Yeah.
I don't need to sleep.
And that's completely counterintuitive based on the data. We know that people are more productive, and we've done some of these studies in the workplace where you look, firstly, underslept employees will take on fewer work challenges overall. They end up taking the simpler ones like listening to voice messages rather than actually digging into deep project work. They produce fewer creative solutions to challenges that you give them. They also slack off. When they're working in groups, it's called social loafing, where they just ride the coattails of other people's hard work. The less sleep that you have, the more willing that you just sort of don't pull your weight. Furthermore, it goes all the way up to the top. So the more or less sleep that a business leader has had from one night to the next, the more or less charismatic their employees will rate that business leader, despite them knowing nothing about the sleep of that CEO. It's evident in their behavior.
Well, because they're short with they're short with their temper.
Yep.
They're quicker to get upset about things. They're less charismatic and social with their conversations.
Yep.
They just want, okay, I got it.
Yeah, it's
go
not someone
to
you want
work.
to work for.
Yeah.
So less sleep does not equal more productivity. And it's always struck me as strange. Why do we sort of overvalue employees that undervalue sleep? And if you look at your
That's true.
workforce, trust me, everyone's going to be looking busy, but it's like stationary bikes. Everyone's looking like they're working hard, but there's no forward progress. The scenery never changes. That's what an underslept workforce will be for you.
Now, what about the amount of time that people spend at work? I mean, I know this is not related to sleep, but I've always felt like people work too much. I feel like you probably could get more done with less time there.
Yeah. So efficiency is what we're talking about here. And that's another one of those things with sleep deprivation. I think many people, when they haven't had a good night of sleep, that they're looking at this report and they realize, geez, I've just read this paragraph the third time and I still can't quite get it.
Because your head's scrambled. Yeah.
Efficiency, productivity.
But I would feel like when people are working 8 hours a day, I don't think that you could work at peak capacity for 8 hours. At least I don't think the average person can.
No, you can't sustain that.
Yeah. So you're kind of bleeding these people. You're getting blood out of a rock in the last couple hours.
And it's not, either a creative way to work, and creativity, is supposed to be the engine of, business and ingenuity. But why would you, take twice the amount of time to boil a pot of water on half heat when you could do it in half the time if you just put it on high? Well, that's sleep.
You know what's interesting, though? There are certain writers who use sleep deprivation as a strategy for creativity. They literally don't start. Like the writers for the sitcom I was on, News Radio, they wouldn't start writing until like 2, 3 in the morning. They would just play video games and fuck around, and then late at night they would really start writing, and they would write till like 7 in the morning. They would stumble into the set like barefoot, delirious, hair all fucked up with hilarious scripts. And it's like they had used being silly and overtired as a strategy, almost like they were doing drugs,
Right.
but they weren't doing any drugs.
I mean, it comes back to, well, we don't know in that scenario, it hasn't been studied, but what we have found, at least in our scientific studies, is that prefrontal cortex region that we spoke about before, that sort of rational, logical part of the brain, that's one of the first things to go when you're sleep deprived. So that area of the brain just gets sort of switched off.
Right.
The more that you are sort of lacking in your sleep. And deep emotional centers of the brain, which are normally controlled and kept in check by that prefrontal cortex, they just erupt in terms of their activity. So you're all emotional gas pedal and too little regulatory control brake, which for the most part, very bad. But, one possibility is that if you want to try and get a little bit sort of, crazy, loosey-goosey, maybe that's not bad for that type of sort of comedic writing, that you become a bit more childlike. And I say that affectionately because the last part of the brain to mature in development is the prefrontal cortex. So you revert back to almost a more childlike state. But I honestly would not condone that sort of, undergoing sleep just based on the mortality and, risk of Alzheimer's and cancer by itself. You just don't want to undersleep.